Today's passage from Isaiah comes early on. It's just chapter 5 out of over 50 chapters, 61, I think, in all. And it's a warning. God likens his chosen people, the Israelites, to a vineyard. And he says that this vineyard that the vineyard owner had such great hopes in has turned out nothing but sour grapes. The harvest has not been good. The grapes are not sweet. It's not worth anything, God says. And so this vineyard will be left exposed to the elements. The walls will be allowed to crumble, which protect it. It won't be pruned. Weeds will grow up and take over. Even the clouds won't rain on it. It will be left to the elements to turn into a wasteland. This prophecy was written at a time when the people of Jerusalem lived surrounded by two hostile empires. One to the north, the Assyrians, who had already conquered northern Israel, and another, the Babylonians, who lived in what is now Iraq, and their capital was pretty close to where Baghdad is now. Empires are like sharks. They like to keep moving and they like to keep devouring. Vladimir Putin wants Russia to be an empire again, and so he feels he needs to acquire territory, so he set his sights on Ukraine. China also wants to be an empire again, so it first took over Tibet and now has its eyes on Taiwan. Gobbling up territory is something which is in the nature of an empire. So when God says the vineyard of Israel will be left to the elements, he's saying that the people of Israel, specifically of Jerusalem and southern Israel, will be left unprotected from the empires around them. And the rest of Isaiah's prophecy makes this very clear. The Babylonians will come. They will hold a long siege around Jerusalem, and they will eventually break in. And when they break in, they will destroy everything. Even the temple will be reduced to rubble. The royal family will be kidnapped and taken in captivity to Babylon, and the rest of the Jews there will be scattered to places like Egypt and other places outside of Israel. And it'll be like that for 70 years. And this did really happen. There's all sorts of independent confirmation that this exile actually happened. And Isaiah predicts it. But what he says is, it's because of the conduct of those in Israel that it happens. Near the end of today's reading, we hear what God is upset about. The rich took too much land for themselves and left too little for anyone else. At a time when land was wealth, joining property to property to property so that the poor couldn't get in anywhere, even at the edges, was a way of marginalizing and impoverishing people who didn't own land. Single families owned vast tracts of land, leaving no room for other farmers or for the poor to survive on that land. God declares, "Woe to you who add house to house and join field to field, till no space is left, and you live alone in the land." We also hear that the air is filled with cries of distress, and the land has been stained by bloodshed. God accuses Israel's 1% a little bit later on in this prophecy of staying up late, getting drunk, waking up hungover, and then accepting bribes and mistreating the innocent. The vineyard has been left to the elements, those empires, because of the selfish greed and cruelty of the rich and powerful. But what's interesting about this passage is that unlike what we usually expect in the Hebrew Scriptures, like, say, in the story of Moses, where God sends plague and plague and plague upon the Pharaoh, in this reading, God doesn't send any punishment at all. He just says, I'm going to let those empires do their thing. I withdraw my protection. That's it. I'm just going to let human nature take its course, and you will not be protected from these empires that surround you. you will be unprotected. In our time, right now, many parts of the world, it also feels as though protection has been withdrawn. In Europe, a searing heat wave has caused record temperatures and droughts across the entire continent. It sparked enormous wildfires in France and Spain. Water is being rationed in France and Germany. Rivers there are literally running dry. The Rhine is getting lower and lower, so is the Danube. The Po River in Italy has gone down by 90%. In Germany, they're worried that barges won't be able to get back and forth through the country because the water levels will get so low that the barges won't be able to clear. And even if the water doesn't completely disappear, the barges can't carry as much as usual. And so the economy is going to see inflation spike because it's taking so long to get even basic things like oil up and down through the country because the rivers are so low. England registered its hottest day ever, reaching 40 degrees. And in recorded history, it's never been that hot. The mayor of London actually put out a warning that people shouldn't leave empty glass bottles lying in parks because the grass has become so dry and flammable that sunlight passing through an empty beer bottle can act like a magnifying glass and ignite the grass. That's where things are at in lovely green England, which isn't green anymore. Massive floods have also become more common, such as the ones we saw hit Kentucky recently. The weather is not acting the way it used to. It's convulsing, behaving in ways we've never seen before. And in its wake are neighborhoods which have been destroyed by floods and fires, water and flames. The world feels increasingly out of control, like we have lost our protection. The scientific explanation for these events is straightforward. This is climate change. This is exactly what they were predicting. The climate would change and become more extreme, and that's happening right now. An excess of carbon molecules, specifically carbon dioxide and methane, are in the air because of our industrial society, our transportation, our factories, the way we make energy. And that results in a rise in greenhouse gases, which cause the air to trap more and more heat. It's complex. A lot of chain reactions have to happen for this to occur down here. So the exact details are hard to predict, but the general trend is clear. The Antarctic is melting. The Arctic is heating up. The seas will rise, coastlines will flood, and that means cities like New York and Boston. Droughts and floods and stronger hurricanes and heat waves are the new normal now. Scientists have been warning us about this for decades, literally. And yet we found it hard to make the sacrifices which they have suggested that we have to make. Part of the problem is that it just sounds so abstract. A bunch of invisible molecules are doing something kilometers above our heads. It's just hard to get worried about or passionate about. And the scientists have said, we think, we guess, we wonder, we're estimating, and their estimations don't always come true. And the fact that they're honest about the fact that they can't nail this down and make absolutely precise predictions has provided enough of a gap that people who want to sow doubt, like politicians and fossil fuel companies, have exploited their honesty to say, it's not certain. It's not for sure. Maybe it isn't human-caused. The other problem, though, for those of us who are inclined to believe the scientists, that this really is climate change and it is caused by human beings, is that it's hard to get excited about chemical reactions. It all seems too abstract. Human beings understand things best when it sounds like other human beings are involved. We have good social intelligence, right? You can see this with little kids. As soon as they can talk, they start giving names to their stuffed animals. They treat their stuffed animals like human beings. That's what comes naturally to the way we think. Adults name ships, right? The Queen Mary. We even name spaceships. The Enterprise. Even spaceships that don't exist, we give names to. And scientists realized long ago that if you really want to get people's attention with a hurricane, you better give it a name. If you want people to evacuate their homes, you better tell them this hurricane with a name is coming your way. Can anyone tell me the name of the hurricane that battered New Orleans so badly 15, 20 years ago? Katrina, right. You all remember, because that hurricane had a name. We process information better when we can think of it in terms of people. And in a sign of the times, just a few weeks ago, the Spanish in the town of Seville dubbed their heat wave Zoe. They gave the heat wave a name because they need people to pay attention and to change their behavior. They hope this will help people take this more seriously. Now, science tells us that there's no consciousness in the storm, there's no consciousness in the heat wave. That's not the way it works. These aren't people. But we need to think about it that way if we're going to take it seriously. Most of us don't have the capacity for abstract thought to get really excited about molecules. But if you can give it a name and make it seem like a person, then you've got our attention. While scientists stress that nature is very different than human beings and has its own agenda, we're going to have to personalize this if we're going to get our heads around it and start changing our behavior. And as spiritual people, we're used to this balancing act. The Bible tells us over and over again that God is too mysterious to be conceived of in human terms, right? In the Ten Commandments, it says, "Thou shalt not have any graven images of me," right? God says, don't make pictures of me, don't draw me, don't make sculptures of me. That was a very important commandment to the Jewish people, which they've taken seriously, as have the Muslims. Right? They don't have pictures of God either. Us Christians went a different way. And that's a whole other story why we went that way. But the point is, on one hand, we're told, don't try and imagine me in human terms. And yet, even within the Hebrew Scriptures, there's human metaphors of God all over the place. The Psalms speak of people sitting at the right hand of God, as though God was holding court at a throne. In Isaiah, the same prophecy we heard from today, we hear God say that the earth is her footstool. She rests her feet on the earth. She is so massive and majestic. And in today's reading, God encourages us to think of God's relationship with the people of Jerusalem as a relationship of a vineyard owner. Very human thing. Vineyards are owned by humans and tended to them, and God's inviting us to think of God that way. God knows us well enough that to use poetic, human-based language is something that we will react to and will remember. At its worst, this tendency to humanize things can descend into baseless conspiracy theories where some billionaires are putting microchips into vaccines, where big things are reduced to really, really small explanations, where a small cabal of people are in charge of a huge conspiracy. That's the dark side of putting things in human terms, where you overestimate what human beings can do. But on the other side, if we can think of natural forces in human terms, we might actually start to react more responsibly. We need a new language to speak of climate change because, folks, it's not going to go away. The droughts and flooding which are happening in Europe this summer could easily hit us next summer. We've already seen climate change's effects in British Columbia with their wildfires, which seem to happen every single year now. While we need to do all we can to get our governments to live up to the Paris Accords and even go further, we also need to come to terms with the fact that whatever we do, the next few decades are going to be really difficult. There's no dodging this bullet. We, Canadians, may be naming a lot of floods and heat waves and even blizzards in the years to come. In the United States, just in the last year or so, several states, the hot ones like Miami and Los Angeles and Phoenix, have created new positions within their municipal government. They're called heat officers. They're the ones who are in charge of making sure that all the departments in the city are cooperating so that they can save lives when it gets too hot. Scientists are warning that there will soon be places in the world, particularly around the equator, where for months at a time it will be simply too hot for human beings to walk around outside without dying. There is a temperature and humidity level at which your sweat doesn't evaporate anymore and you just start to have your internal organs heat up. And at that point, survival is about whether you have access to air conditioning or not. And in the global south, there's a lot of people who do not have the wealth to afford air conditioning. That's the reality that we are facing now. And it is likely that millions of those people will become climate refugees. And they're going to want to come to a big, mostly empty, cold country that has a lot of water. No matter what happens now, life is going to be tougher than it was. Even with the climate bill, which the Americans just passed, which has all sorts of backdoor deals for petroleum companies to keep mining and to keep drilling and keep getting natural gas out of the ground. The droughts and wildfires we're seeing now are likely to become the norm rather than the exception going forward. So, how do we deal with this emotionally? Because it's no fun to hear about. And it's much easier to cover our ears and just pretend that it's not happening. But it is happening. So how do we deal with it emotionally? Well, unfortunately, popular culture is not very much help with this. If you watch Hollywood movies about what happens to the world when things go badly, their advice is buy a lot of guns, buy a whole bunch of stock up your stockroom with survival stuff like extra food and bullets and so forth, and get ready to defend you and your own. That kind of greedy selfishness is exactly what got us into this mess, so it's unlikely to get us out. Christianity, though, suggests another way. When Jesus walked the earth, he told them that they, his disciples, were going to face difficult times. This is a faith that's odd in many ways, and one of them is Jesus said, if you follow me, there's a good chance you will be persecuted and people will kill you. And it's a miracle this faith survived its early days with advice like that. But the point that Jesus was making was that when you go down this path, you can expect resistance. But the way he suggested they deal with that resistance can be useful to us now. Because he told his followers not to embrace bitterness or become defensive. But he said instead, love your enemies. Love those who oppose you. Pray for them and help them when you can. His parable about the Good Samaritan explicitly shows this. The Samaritans were deeply, deeply resented by the Jews. These two groups did not get along. And yet it's a Samaritan, a sworn enemy of the Jews, who stops to help a Jewish man who's been left for dead on the side of the road. The Good Samaritan brings the man to the nearest inn and tells the innkeeper that he will pay whatever it takes to restore this poor stranger to good health. In the decades that lie ahead of us, there's going to be a lot of people who are at risk of being as good as dead on the road, who are going to come our way seeking help. And Christ suggests that the answer is not to hide, but to extend protection. Protection for each other, to strangers, and to the millions of climate refugees who will want to enter this country. But as the reading from Isaiah suggests, we also need to provide protection for the land. So this won't be easy. We have to create a balancing act between the needs of the land so it can stay healthy and the needs of the people. The land needs a chance to recover from our incursions. We need to stop sending so much carbon into the air. We've taken far too much land for ourselves, like the reading suggested. If today's reading has any wisdom for us, it's the warning that when we withdraw protection from each other, protection for us can also be withdrawn. We must declare, like the Good Samaritan, that we're willing to pay the bill, no matter how much it costs, to restore the health of the one who needs help. The paradox is the right to protection is earned through offering protection. And there'll be many who will say, as things get hotter and more people come our way, close the border. Don't let them in. We got to just look out for ourselves. And yet our good book suggests those who look out for themselves will lose the protection that God has to offer. The safer route is to offer protection to those who need it. As we make our way through these dangerous times, let us remember that God will be with us, encouraging us to find a new way forward based on love, compassion, and the offer of protection. As counterintuitive as it may sound, generosity must be our guiding principle now, not greed. We've been blessed by being placed in a country which is huge. There's lots of space. This country will not suffer from climate change in the same way that equatorial Africa and the other equatorial regions will. Our lifestyle, however, has contributed to the problem which they are suffering from. So surely it falls to us to help them when they need our help, even if it means changing our idea of what Canada is. We're so used to thinking of Canada as a minor nation, morally virtuous but not particularly powerful. But some people have been encouraging us to think big. We could have 100 million people here by the end of the century. If we go down that path, let's make it so that we became a place of refuge for those who suffered from the lifestyle we enjoyed for a century. Surely we owe them that much. Greed has had its day, yielding a harvest of sour grapes. Now is time for us to practice another way. One where, offering help and protection, we may find ourselves being the one who needs and receives protection. And in that virtuous circle where we help others and they help us, we're inspired to share God's love with others, knowing that even as we walk through the scorching valley of the shadow of death, God is with us, and we are not alone. Amen.